Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in here on Thursday, a nice sunny Thursday, a little breezy, right before spring break, so everything's coming up roses here. Happy St. Patrick's Day as well. My screen is showing a little green for you, just for fun. Okay, so it's been a while since I checked in here. I have just posted what will end up being below this video, a flyer for the Spring 2016 Sonnet Writing Contest here at COD. So it's part of a whole group of events that we are organizing in honor of, like it says here, the 400th anniversary of William Shakespeare's death. Obviously a famous sonneteer, in addition to all the plays that he wrote. So I really encourage anybody in our class to enter the contest here. You can, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the sonnet form, specifically the Shakespearean sonnet for obvious reasons, you can certainly contact me, but it's easy enough to Google that kind of stuff and get the basic formal rules for it. The deadline's coming up March 30th. We have some prizes to go with: COD gift card to the bookstore, Einstein Bagel, Starbucks, just kind of, neat little stuff. Yeah, I think anybody in our course would be a great candidate for entering this contest. It coincides nicely, coincidentally, with where we're at right now, just looking at our due dates here, moving into our next genre, obviously poetry. So we've moved through the creative nonfiction workshop. I'm just in the midst of grading and giving some comments back for that. Then we look at, we get into poetry with a look at this idea of the poetic mind that I think is a pretty interesting unit that brings some fairly traditional thinking about poetry and sort of that creative mindset. It brings a fairly traditional approach to that with a much more contemporary version of kind of the same expression, or an expression of the same kind of idea, which is pretty neat. And then obviously we have spring break, and then we come back into our poetry workshop. So once again, as we work towards the workshop, you really want to be working on the workshop as well. So poetry for most people is not as page intensive as like the creative nonfiction essay or certainly a short story, but I'm still hoping that you'll spend considerable time on it, thinking that most famous poets, most published poets, they take, months or years to write a poem. Clearly, they're not clocking in from 9 to 5 every single Monday to Friday working on that one thing. So, you can overstate how much time it takes to write a poem, but there's certainly ample evidence of like the manuscript history of certain poems that they exist in their published form, but we can actually track back because authors will keep, earliest drafts, revisions, manuscripts that they share with other people to get feedback. T.S. Eliot, who figures in our Unit 9, is actually a great example of that. There's a terrific book. One of his famous poems is called The Wasteland, and that went through an extensive process of revision by him, getting feedback from others, major changes that he made. Now, it's a fairly long and kind of near epic poem in some ways, relatively speaking, but it certainly wasn't the product of just, a couple weeks of work. So for us, you're probably thinking about like a page, maybe a 2-page poem. We don't need anything super long necessarily. If you happen to be interested in more shorter forms, so you end up with, 10 lines or whatever, then feel free to post more than just that one work. Maybe even think of a series of short poems that might be connected in some way. So certainly you're not going to produce the same page numbers as we might have done for the fiction essay or creative nonfiction or the fiction story, but you can still be spending considerable time on this, working through some revisions, and also thinking about posting more than just that one poem. You could certainly even post multiple poems, but ask your group for feedback on specifically just one of them or some aspect of them if they work as a series. And then notice that we turn around, we're getting sort of close to the end of our course as we come out of spring break. We turn around from the poetry workshop to our final workshop, which is an open genre, which means you can return to anything that we've done before. It might be poetry, the creative nonfiction, could be short fiction, if you wanted to return to that genre and try something different or a different story in that genre. Or there might be other genres that we haven't really covered in this class that you'd be interested in trying out. If you want to kind of go off track a little bit, that's great, but do check with me just so we can talk about what are some of the parameters for that. Is it going to work in the workshop format? How might you submit it if it's not a sort of like a traditional text file type of thing? So it's certainly open, like it says, but again, you want to be in touch with me a little bit. We'll have the chance to conference again, and then we sort of turn around to the end of our course. Okay, so oh, a couple of things I wanted to say really quickly about poetry then. Take a look at our units list so you can look at something different for a while. Poetry is one of those genres that, I don't know, it carries a lot of baggage with it, it seems to me. People have a lot of pre or even misconceptions about what it has to be, what it can't be. We learn a lot of what we think about poetry from sort of bad sources in some ways. So often we think of poetry and lyrics as kind of the same thing, and they share certain elements that are the same, but there's a lot that you can get away with in lyrics because obviously you have usually now a whole kind of visual thing to go along with it, but all of that musical stuff as well. So there's a lot of simple end rhymes, lots of repetition and that kind of stuff. And that's sort of a bad model for writing poetry. Notice that we learn that in children's verse as well, which is where most people are first introduced to poetry on the page, even if it's like Dr. Seuss, which is great for getting people interested in like the sound of language and just kind of how funny language can be sometimes. But for our purposes, we don't want to depend, or we don't have to depend on always rhyming or having a really sort of simple metrical scheme so it sounds like children's verse almost unintentionally because that's kind of what we've learned, or because we're used to hearing poetry in the form of lyrics. We think again those perfect end rhymes, all of our lines have to rhyme, or we have to have these rhyming couplets in the same way that a song would do. So there's some bad kind of examples there. Obviously they're good in their own place, but they don't necessarily translate into good models for our kind of poetry writing. Again, you can flip through our textbook and probably find a bunch of different sorts of poems that maybe they rhyme in certain ways, but there's lots of ways that they wouldn't make good lyrics at all, or certainly not children's verse. The other thing with poetry, for some reason, is that people often feel obliged to write about big, philosophical, kind of life, huge problems, even trying to solve them in a poem, which is really kind of going to take you in a wrong direction. But I don't know why poetry has this sort of inflated value, or we think it has to be about big, important things, but clearly it doesn't. In fact, some of the best poems are about pretty everyday, common type things, but presented in a way that almost makes us see them new, see them in a new way. You'll notice that this basic theory of the poetic mind that's expressed in Unit 9 is fundamentally getting people to see everyday things in a new way by bringing things that are apparently different but sort of together. The obvious way that we do that is through the literary device of analogy or comparative language. Whether it's a simile that uses like or as, more metaphoric or figurative language, but that fundamental approach of comparison is really how poetry works best. It doesn't have to be about big philosophical premises. It doesn't have to be about solving global warming or kind of big stuff like that. Again, poetry is weird because often people feel obliged to like rhyme because they think poems rhyme. They feel obliged to have it sort of sing-songy because maybe that's what we've been trained to think about. By the same token, we think of poetry as reserved for elevated thoughts or ideas or the big, big picture, when really, again, that doesn't usually produce the best poems. The unusual contrary to that, though, is that despite that poetry has this sort of grandiosity attached to it, for the most part, people think it's really marginal in our culture. Very few people read poetry just as a thing to do. Few people would declare themselves as poets in kind of, with your general sort of group of people or your family or whatever, depending on who you hang out with, of course. But if you're in a writing class, then yeah, we agree that poetry is a thing we do and we're going to be poets for at least a couple of units here, but not something that you necessarily advertise to your boss or everybody under the sun because it has all this baggage attached to it. People think that poets are kind of dark and brooding and we wear berets and drink thick coffee or whatever. Not the case. So there's all the baggage attached to it, and it's really marginal in some ways. Like, we think poetry is just this kind of weird, off-the-charts thing that some strange people do. But if you think about it, it's also really central to our culture, not only in the form of lyrics. Again, they share some things in common, but a lot of advertising takes the form of poetry. It's sort of like the intensity of language is what makes the advertising work. Think also about when we have big, either private or public occasions in our life, whether it's like a wedding, a birth, the inauguration of the president, things like that, like big, either public or private moments. So often we don't write a short story about them. We write or we quote from famous poetry. So again, it's like poetry is kind of marginal and marginalized, and yet so deeply central. It has this sort of tense existence in our culture. So I am a big fan of poetry. It's kind of my area of emphasis within the realm of creative writing. And I continue to be fascinated by all of these facets, that what people believe poetry is, what they think it should be, where did they kind of learn those rules almost subconsciously, how they think they have to now write poetry, what they think it should be about, and this weird dichotomy between it being kind of this marginal thing, but also really, really central if you think about where it shows up in public, but also in our private lives. So hopefully you can enter into poetry with the spirit sort of openness, of not feeling like it has to be this, it has to be that. And even if it's a genre that you find a little bit intimidating, which is the case for a lot of people, that if you read widely enough, and if you get over that sense that poetry has to be this elevated language about elevated things, it can really be a fun genre to work in. In fact, we sort of can recapture some of the fun from that children's verse, maybe not in the same way exactly, but that's how it works so well to invite children into the world of language and just how strange and weird and odd it can be. All right, so hopefully you have some fun with the poetry Unit 9, and then going into the poetry workshop, and then thinking, of course, ahead to that open genre workshop as well. So hopefully everyone also has a great spring break. Enjoy the weather, and I will see everybody kind of recharged once we come back from spring break. Oh, and don't forget, enter the sonnet writing contest. A perfect time to do so, given that we are entering into our poetry unit here.